so now we're going to talk about import quotas, and we're going to do a small country analysis again. Okay, so import quotas for a small country. Again, start off by drawing the market for our home country. Demand curve, supply curve, and put in our world price. Okay. Quantity demanded at the world price, quantity supplied at the world price. And over here, we're going to put our international or world market. An import demand curve starts at the autarky price, downward sloping from there. And again, we're going back to this small country scenario. So again, the export supply curve is just a horizontal line. And here is the quantity of imports. That's our M0 with our world price. Okay. Now, an import quota is a restriction on the quantity of the good that can be imported. Right? So a tariff is, hey, we're going to put basically a tax on imports of the good when they come into the country. The import quota says, instead of putting a tax on the units of the good that are imported, we're just going to restrict the quantity. So how do we show this? Well, we'll say we'll pick some quota level. And let's say that's in here somewhere. Now, the easiest way to draw these is to just go ahead and do something like this. Just pick your quota, put it in there, and then draw down the quantities. Okay. So our quota in this case is simply given by QD1 minus QS1. Okay, so we're picking. So that's our quota. That's our quantity. We'll just go ahead and draw it in here. Show the quantity supplied and demanded at that level. Now, what does that mean for our domestic economy? So one other way to see this is, let's go ahead and draw the quota. Right. So we'll call it M1, let's go ahead and draw the quota in here. If we draw our quota in here, right, so our quota is basically saying now the supply curve is just a fixed quantity at M1. And that's it. That you're no longer allowed to import anything beyond M1. Well, what is the willingness to pay for that last unit of the import that comes from our import demand curve? That means that the domestic price is now going to go to P1. So we can draw that price right back over here, right? And that's the same price that we're seeing here, right? So a quota ends up raising the domestic price. Right? The difference is that increase in the price isn't coming because of the tax, because of the tariff, but because the restriction in the quantity that can be imported causes consumers to push up the price, right? There are fewer, right? There's less of the good to go around, and there are plenty of people who are willing to pay more than the world price to get that good because their willingness to pay is well above PW. So looking at things again, so far actually, when we start off looking at this, we don't see too much that's different from our tariff case. So again, go ahead and label our areas A, B, C, and D. And again, recognize that this is also C. And this triangle here again is B and D. Okay. So we're looking at changes in surplus. Again, change in consumer surplus. As before, consumers lose. And they're losing A, B, C, and D. Our producers are losing A, or gaining A rather, once again. And now, here's the big question. What happens to C? Okay? That's actually really the big question here. And so for now, we can leave kind of a question mark. Okay? So ultimately, the real question here is what happens to C? Okay? So we have a couple of different scenarios. As you can imagine, in the most basic scenario, the government just goes and hands out the quota licenses to domestic importers, okay, and says, you know what, here you go. You guys, you have the right to import, domestic importers, you have the right to import a certain quantity of the good. You go ahead. So what's going to happen in that case? Well, the domestic importers, right, they're going to purchase the good at the world price of PW, and we're not affecting the world price. It's still at PW. So they're going to import the good at PW, but then they're going to turn around and sell it at the higher price in the local market of P1. So these guys are going to end up getting this surplus, potentially, right? So in a best case scenario, this what we're calling the government revenue is actually now what we call the quota rents, right? And it becomes a question of who gets those, right? What we used to call the government revenue, it's a question of who gets it. We're calling it the quota rent. So in the first scenario, the domestic suppliers end up, or actually think about it as the resellers, right? The importers end up getting the quota rents. In that case, right, that C ends up going to the resellers, right? So it's not the government anymore, but still you're left with a net loss of B and D. So in this, and we think of this as a best case scenario, or one of the best case scenarios, okay? The quota rents go to the domestic, the importers, the resellers. They end up getting the rents instead of the government, but it's okay. It's a domestic group that's getting it. So in terms of the net change in welfare and total surplus, we're left with the same scenario as we had for the tariff. This is why we talk about quotas as having a tariff equivalency. In other words, you could get the same result from a welfare perspective and from domestic price and the quantity imported with a quota or a tariff. So if you think about it, we have potentially a tariff in here, right, that's equal to, right, potentially you could say, you know what, I could put a tariff in place that's equal to this price difference that would yield a level of imports M1 equal or equivalent to the tariff, right, or the quota. So you have an equivalency here. Right? You can impose either a tariff or a quota and achieve the same net result in terms of domestic price and quantity imported. The potential difference comes in terms of our welfare analysis. So in the first scenario outlined, there's no difference. Now, alternatively, the government could also auction off these rights to import. Right? In the first scenario, we said, just have the government just hand them out. Yeah, but how would the government determine who gets how much of each quota? So one alternative or one way of implementing it will be to have the government just auction them off, in which case the potential importers should be willing to pay a value up to C to purchase those rights to the quotas. So then our quota rents go back to the government. Right? The government, instead of just handing out the import, right, the import licenses, is auctioning them off. So again, from a net welfare perspective, no difference, right? It's still a loss of B and D, right? The difference is in who gets C. If the government's auctioning off the licenses, they get the quota rents. If they're just handing them out, they go to the importers. But let's go back to that first scenario where the firms are being, they're not auctioned off, but they're being given to them. Well, the question then is, how does the government determine who gets them? Well, what if they end up basing it on the previous year's production? So the year before they put the import quota in place. If that's the case, and if firms know this is coming down the pipeline, they have an incentive to try to game the system, right? They may try to produce more, or they may try to, I don't know, bribe, wine and dine, do whatever to get a larger share of those, of the quota licenses. In that case, they might end up expending economic activity that ends up eroding C. And we call that rent-seeking activity. And in the worst case scenario, as far as rent-seeking activity goes, the firms, in their attempts to get some of these quota licenses for themselves, might end up eroding all of the quota rents through that rent-seeking activity. And so if you have rent-seeking, in that scenario, the net ends up being B, D, and now C. And we end up losing those quota rents through rent-seeking activity. So in that case, the quota is worse from a net welfare perspective than the tariff. The last scenario you want to consider is a case of something like where you basically give the licenses to the exporting firms in the foreign country. In that case, that C, that quota rent, goes to foreign producers. That's going to make them happy, but as far as the domestic welfare scenario, you get the same net effect as the rent-seeking case. So in the end, what we're left with is, for a small country, quotas are at best equivalent in welfare impact to a tariff. At worst, in worst case scenarios, they're actually worse than a tariff. So if you're considering as a government either or, tariffs are going to be the better way to go. Okay. Now, of course, there are a lot of caveats with this. Everything we just did here was for a small country. And there are a lot of questions about information. Does the government have full information about costs, things like that? These are first blush basic analyses of the potential impacts of tariffs and quotas. In the next chapter, we're going to kind of switch gears, and instead of looking at trade policies aimed at restricting trade, right, looking at the demand side, we're going to look at trade policies that are aimed at boosting exports. And we're going to do a very similar type of analysis. Everything's going to focus on supply and demand analyses with looking at changes in consumer producer surplus and government revenue.